At 3:45 a.m., the radar screen flickered. The dots looked like ghosts. The operator whispered, "They're coming." The room was small, colder than the summer air outside. The hum of machines mixed with the faint hiss of static. Over the white cliffs, the sea was black, empty, but inside the chain-home radar station near Ventnor, the sky had already come alive. Sergeant John Hopkins leaned forward, his eyes burning from hours without sleep. On the cathode tube before him, a pale green line swept in endless circles. Then, a cluster of echoes appeared where there should have been nothing. He rubbed his eyes. The line passed again. The blips remained. 50, no more. 100. He blinked hard. 200. He reached for the phone. Filter room. This is Ventnor. Multiple contacts, heading northwest, altitude unknown. His voice shook despite his training. A pause on the other end. Then, bored. Probably weather. Hopkins glanced at the watch on his wrist. 3:46 a.m., August 13th, 1940. The day had barely begun. He could already smell the metal and ozone in the air, the faint scent of rain mixed with oil from the generators. Outside, somewhere beyond the horizon, an entire war was moving toward him. He turned to the woman beside him, Corporal Margaret Ellis, WAF. She couldn't have been older than 20. Her headphones pressed tight against her hair as she logged readings in neat handwriting, the pencil trembling only slightly. "It's not weather," she said quietly. "Look at the spread." The echoes were too clean, too rhythmic. It wasn't a storm. It was formation. Hopkins tightened the phone cord around his hand. "Filter room, I repeat. Heavy concentration, likely enemy aircraft, range 120 miles. Another pause. A sigh. "We've had false returns all week, Sergeant. The equipment's still temperamental. Maybe check your calibration?" Hopkins felt heat rising in his chest. He could already picture what was coming. The sound of engines, the fires, the black smoke curling above Southampton. "Sir," he said, steady now, "this isn't calibration. This is a fleet in the sky." Behind him, the machines kept their low, hypnotic hum. The thin paper roll from the receiver printed a steady heartbeat of lines and spikes. Each pulse meant movement, distance, life. Margaret's fingers hovered over the keys of the plotting board, waiting for confirmation. He nodded once, and she began to mark the positions, one red circle after another, spreading toward the coast. The door burst open. A flight lieutenant entered, shirt half-buttoned, rubbing his eyes. "What's the panic?" Hopkins pointed at the scope. The lieutenant leaned in, squinting. "Could be ground clutter. Could be." The dots doubled, then tripled. The room went still. "Good God," the officer muttered. He picked up the line to headquarters. "This is Ventnor. We have visual radar confirmation, large formation inbound. Estimate 200 aircraft, heading London." Outside, the first wind of dawn cut across the hills. Hopkins stepped out for a moment, his eyes adjusting to the dark horizon. He couldn't see them yet. No lights, no shapes, but he could feel it, the vibration in the air, like thunder before the flash. When the sirens began to wail 20 minutes later, the towns below woke in confusion. Mothers carried children to basements. Dogs barked at the sky. Above the southern coast, the sound grew, a low, endless growl, rolling closer. Inside the bunker, the operators kept their positions. They watched the green blips multiply until the screen was a storm of ghosts. Hopkins whispered, almost to himself, "God help them." Margaret didn't look up from the plotting board. "You think they'll believe us now?" He didn't answer. The phone rang again. New orders, new bearings, more targets. The voice on the other end spoke quickly, almost breathless. "Confirmed hostile aircraft over the channel. All squadrons scramble." Hopkins exhaled for the first time in minutes. He pulled off his headset and listened. Through the thick walls, he could already hear it. The distant roar of Merlin engines taking flight. Britain's answer was rising into the dawn. Later, they would call this day Adlertag, Eagle Day, the beginning of Hitler's great assault. But at that moment, all Hopkins knew was the cold sweat on his neck and the faint echo fading from his screen. He wrote in his logbook, 3:45, large-scale contact. Not weather. Confirmed attack. His handwriting was calm, measured. But next to it, a small stain of ink had spread, a tremor caught forever in paper. For the radar crews, the battle began long before anyone saw it. They fought it in silence, in flickers of light, in whispers down telephone lines. They saw the war before it reached the sky. As the sirens echoed down the coast, the lieutenant turned to him and said, "You realize, Hopkins, this machine of yours, it's the only thing between us and the fire." Hopkins looked at the glowing scope, the ghost still moving toward England, and said quietly, "Then let's hope it's enough." But few knew that this invisible weapon, the one that would save Britain, had been dismissed as madness just a few years earlier. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. He said he could spot a plane using radio waves. They laughed. Then they sent him to a field with a kite and a car battery. It was 1935, on a bleak February morning at a Royal Air Force testing range near Felixstowe, a lonely stretch of coast where the North Sea chewed endlessly at the sand. Dr. Robert Watson Watt stood there in a rumpled coat, clutching a mug of lukewarm tea and squinting at the gray horizon. He was a physicist, not a soldier, and his hands still bore the stains of graphite and tobacco from the laboratory. Around him, engineers fussed with cables, batteries, and a transmitter box that looked like something built from spare parts of a radio shop. They were there to test an idea the Air Ministry had already dismissed as impossible. The generals wanted a death ray, a beam that could burn enemy pilots from the sky. Watson Watt had told them the truth. "Gentlemen, I can't make you a death ray, but perhaps I can give you ears." The room had fallen silent. Someone laughed. Another muttered, "We asked for a sword, not a hearing aid." Still, the government gave him one day to prove it. So now he stood in the wind, watching a slow-moving biplane drag a long wire antenna through the mist. In the back of a van, an assistant adjusted the dials, straining to hear anything but static. Nothing. Just the pulse of the transmitter and the hiss of the sea. The men began to shift impatiently. One officer checked his watch. "Perhaps the Germans will wait until the professor finishes tinkering," he said dryly. Then, faintly, a rhythm, a heartbeat of signal returning through the noise. Watson Watt leaned over the oscilloscope, his breath fogging the glass. There it was again, a tiny ripple each time the plane passed. He scribbled notes furiously. Amplitude increase. Clear reflection at 30 megahertz. His pulse quickened. The sky had just answered back. He turned to the group. "We caught the echo," he said, trying not to sound too proud. "It works. The sky can speak." No one clapped. The officers exchanged glances, half amused, half uneasy. One muttered, "Probably interference." Another added, "We can't fight with that." The van filled with the smell of ozone and disbelief. Yet the thin green line on the screen didn't care about opinions. It pulsed steadily, proof that the invisible could be measured. That night, in his notebook, Watson Watt wrote simply, "First detection by reflected radio waves. Future uncertain." He underlined the last word twice. Weeks passed. Reports were filed, misfiled, and shelved. A colonel at the Air Ministry called the project an academic indulgence. Funding was slashed. The scientist who had made the air itself visible found himself arguing for spare parts. He spent months visiting London offices with diagrams rolled under his arm, trying to explain how a few towers and transmitters might one day guard an island. Most of the officials couldn't even picture it. "We'll never be invaded by air," one said confidently. "We have the channel." But across that same channel, in Germany, engineers were already perfecting the engines of the Messerschmitt. The storm was forming. Watson Watt worked on in silence. He recruited a handful of engineers and radio amateurs, men who believed enough to keep soldering wires long after midnight. They tested antennas on the roofs of barns, in muddy fields, along empty stretches of coast. Sometimes, at dawn, they managed to catch a faint echo from a passing aircraft. Each success felt like stealing a secret from the future. One of his assistants, a young woman named Eileen Young, later wrote in her diary, "We had no uniforms, no orders, no glory, only static and hope. When the equipment buzzed, we cheered like children." By summer 1936, the Air Ministry reluctantly allowed a larger experiment. At Orford Ness, for steel towers rose above the dunes, crude and skeletal. The locals thought they were radio masts for shipping. In truth, they were the first ears of Britain's coming defense. When the test plane flew past at 12 miles, the screen lit up again, stronger, clearer. This time no one laughed. Still, money remained scarce. Officials debated whether the professor's ghost machine was worth the cost. One memo from Whitehall read, "Effectiveness unproven. Recommend continued observation, minimal expenditure." It might have ended there, a curiosity forgotten in peacetime. Then, one evening, as the scientists packed up for the day, news crackled over the wireless. Germany had re-entered the Rhineland. The world was shifting. Watson Watt listened in silence, the radio light flickering across his face. "They won't stop now," he said quietly. "We'll need every mile of air we can see." The next morning, he returned to the coast and drew a line in the sand with his boot. "From here," he told his team, "we'll build a wall of waves." Years later, when the Luftwaffe darkened the sky, those same towers would stand like sentinels along the shore, their signals pulsing through rain and smoke. The scientists who had once begged for funding would give Britain 15 precious minutes of warning, enough time to launch the fighters that would keep the island alive. But in 1935, all Watson Watt had was a kite, a radio, and a stubborn faith that sound could see. If Germany had attacked in 1938, there would have been no radar. Just hope and binoculars. From Dover to Aberdeen, a forest of steel towers. Not castles, not guns, but the eyes of a nation. By the spring of 1939, the British coastline looked like something from another world. The war hadn't yet come, but the fear of it hummed in every conversation, every newspaper headline. On the cliffs and fields of Kent, Norfolk, and Suffolk, tall metal skeletons were rising. For transmitting towers, for receiving, connected by a web of cables that crackled with invisible power. To fishermen and farmers, they looked absurd. "What are they building up there?" people asked. A bridge to America? The truth was stranger. Each tower hummed with a faint pulse, a heartbeat made of radio waves. The pulse went out into the sky, hit whatever moved, and came back. The data traveled down miles of wire to a darkened room where a young woman traced a green echo on a glass screen and whispered, "Contact." They called it Chain Home, the most ambitious secret project Britain had ever built. At the center of it all was Robert Watson Watt, the dreamer who had once stood in the cold with a kite and a car battery. Now he stood in muddy boots on the cliffs of Bodsey, wind ripping at his coat, watching cranes hoist another steel tower into the sky. Each one took weeks to erect, and the engineers worked under constant pressure. The German bombers in Poland had already shown the world what air power could do. England was next. The race wasn't for weapons anymore, it was for time. An engineer named Bill Easton recorded in his log that April, "The wind tore the scaffolding again today. One man broke his arm, but the signal came through at dusk, clear as a bell. Worth it." They built in storms, by lantern light, sometimes with their bare hands when the cranes failed. Local villagers brought them tea, not knowing they were watching history take shape in their own fields. When a farmer's wife asked what the towers were for, one worker smiled and said, "To talk to the angels." By the end of the year, 20 stations stretched along the coast, each one synchronized to form a continuous shield. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't even modern by laboratory standards. The transmitters were crude, the receivers temperamental, the operators undertrained. But together they formed something no other country possessed, a wall made of waves, invisible but unbreakable. Still, secrecy ruled everything. Only a handful of commanders in the Royal Air Force knew how the system truly worked. To the pilots, the voice on the radio that told them enemy approaching from the channel was just intuition, some uncanny magic from the control room. They never asked where the information came from. They just trusted it and flew. Inside those control rooms, the filter girls of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force handled the chaos. They listened to dozens of stations at once, each operator calling out numbers through crackling lines. The women plotted red and blue markers on vast wooden tables under dim lights, translating raw echoes into a living map of the sky. One of them later said, "We felt like conductors of an orchestra we couldn't see. Every beat could mean life or death." By June 1939, the system reached from the Isle of Wight to the Firth of Forth. The engineers celebrated by opening a single bottle of gin and pouring it into chipped teacups. Someone raised a toast. To the invisible wall. Watson Watt said nothing. He only looked out to sea and murmured, "Let's hope we never need it." But they did. That September, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain declared war. The world shifted overnight. In the darkness along the coast, the towers began to hum, transmitting constantly now. The operators worked in shifts around the clock, their eyes fixed on the glowing scopes. Each green pulse was a question. Are they coming? At first, the air stayed empty. Then, small tests, lone German reconnaissance planes darting over the channel. The operators tracked them, sent the coordinates to Fighter Command, and watched as RAF Hurricanes intercepted them within minutes. It worked. The chain was alive. One officer in Bentley Priory, the headquarters of Fighter Command, wrote in his diary, "The miracle is not the pilots. It's the people who see the battle before it begins." The German pilots soon noticed that every time they crossed the coast, British fighters seemed to appear out of nowhere. They couldn't explain it. Some believed there were hidden observers with telescopes, others whispered of supernatural help. The truth was simpler and far more terrifying. Britain could see them long before they arrived. By the summer of 1940, the wall of waves stretched across the island like an invisible fortress. Even as bombs began to fall on France, the stations kept expanding northward. The engineers called their towers our sentinels and gave them names: Dover, Vintner, Poling, Trimingham, as if each were a living soldier holding the line. They were ugly. They were loud. But they worked. When the first sirens wailed over Southampton in August, the operators were already at their posts. Their screens glowed like small green suns, marking the paths of hundreds of incoming bombers. The reports raced through the wires to the plotting tables, to the command rooms, to the airfields. Engines roared to life. The island awakened. In the chaos that followed, no one on the ground saw the wall itself, but it held. And because of it, Britain survived. When the sirens wailed in 1940, the radar operators already knew. The Battle of Britain had begun. In the control room, the women watched dots move like raindrops. For them, just signals. For the pilots, life or death. The summer of 1940 arrived warm and clear, but the sky above Britain had turned into a chessboard of war. Inside the vast, dim hall of Bentley Priory, the nerve center of Fighter Command, 18-year-old women in crisp blue uniforms pushed colored markers across a giant map of southern England. Each magnet on the board represented a squadron in the air. Each red light on the wall meant enemy aircraft detected by radar. Above them, officers barked orders through headsets, voices clipped, urgent, precise. Eileen Younghusband, a plotter with the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, would later write in her memoir, "We saw the war before anyone heard it." From the coast came the reports. Chain home stations from Dover to Vintner calling in with coordinates. Raid 85, strength 300 plus, altitude 12,000, heading northwest. The words were code, but everyone in the room felt the weight of them. At the center of the hall stood Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, tall, thin, eyes hidden behind rimless glasses. The pilots called him Stuffy, but his calm voice ruled the chaos. In his hands, the entire defense of Britain fit on a single board. Lines of communication linked radar operators, regional control rooms, and squadrons of young pilots scattered across the countryside. It was the first time in history that war had been fought through information. At 10:12 a.m., an officer called out, "Raid 85 approaching Channel Coast." Dowding leaned closer. Vector 12 group to intercept. Angels 12, bogies inbound. The command raced down the line, through telephone exchanges and radio sets, until it reached the airfields. Somewhere in Kent, a pilot dropped his teacup and ran for his Hurricane. Scramble! Scramble! Sirens blared across the tarmac. Engines roared to life. Wheels lifted from grass runways, and the blue sky filled with silver wings. They told us, Angels 12, bogies inbound. One pilot would later recall. I didn't know what radar was, but I trusted the voice. Above the channel, the two forces met, 1,000 planes twisting through sunlight and smoke. To the civilians below, it looked like a storm of glinting metal, the contrails crossing like white scars in the sky. But inside Bentley Priory, the battle unfolded silently, a ballet of red and blue counters sliding across the table. Every move, every kill, every loss played out in miniature long before the news reached the ground. In one corner, Eileen updated the northern sector board, her pencil racing. Enemy turning east, regrouping. Sweat dripped from her temple, smudging the ink on the log sheet. The room pulsed with noise, phones ringing, voices shouting, teleprinters chattering. Yet beneath it all, there was rhythm, a strange harmony of chaos made orderly. Doubting's system, as it came to be known, was working. Radar detected the enemy. Observers confirmed their path. Controllers dispatched fighters with surgical precision. No longer did the RAF waste planes guessing where to fly. Every move was targeted, calculated, alive with purpose. The room became a living organism, Britain's heartbeat under siege. But outside, the cost was brutal. Pilots climbed into burning skies again and again, sometimes 5 times a day. When their planes returned riddled with holes, mechanics patched them overnight. The operators in Bentley Priory never saw the faces of the men they guided, only the fading markers that disappeared when a call sign went silent. At 4:30 that afternoon, a young controller named Joan called out, "Blue leader no longer transmitting." The room fell quiet for a heartbeat. Doubting simply nodded. "Mark position," he said. The red light on the wall flickered, then went dark. One more ghost in the storm. Outside the building, the sun was still shining. Gardeners in nearby houses paused to listen to the distant thunder of engines. Children pointed to the sky, tracing the white spirals of combat that would later be called dogfights. To them, it looked almost beautiful, a dance above the clouds. Only those inside Bentley Priory knew how many lives each movement cost. By August, the raids had grown larger, the attacks relentless. Germany called it Unternehmen Adlerangriff, Operation Eagle Attack, their plan to crush the RAF before invading the island. Every morning, the same pattern repeated. Dots appeared on radar, phones rang, squadrons scrambled. Every evening, the same silence returned, broken only by the distant wail of ambulances. Still, the system held. Britain was fighting not just with courage, but with calculation, with an invisible web of signals that turned chaos into control. One officer described it best in a letter home. "We fight in rooms full of silence and light. They die in the sky, and we move a magnet half an inch. But that half inch can change the course of the war." By September, the Luftwaffe's commanders grew uneasy. Their bombers were being intercepted before reaching target, their losses mounting. Some pilots swore the British had a secret weapon, something that let them see through clouds and darkness. They were right. But even in Berlin, no one could yet imagine what it was. And so the question began to haunt them. How did the British always know? But Germany soon realized something was wrong. Their bombers were dying. And no one knew why. They were already waiting for us. As if the British could see through clouds. That's how one Luftwaffe pilot described the raids over England in the summer of 1940. From the airfields of northern France, they took off at dawn. Hundreds of bombers escorted by Messerschmitt fighters, engines trembling in perfect rhythm. The air smelled of gasoline, sweat, and nerves. Some men carried Lucky Charms, others small bottles of cognac. Each believed they would return by lunch. Few did. By the second week of August, it was clear something was wrong. Every raid, no matter the time, no matter the weather, met resistance. British fighters appeared like ghosts out of the sun, always in the right place, always waiting. The Germans changed their flight paths, their altitudes, their schedules. It didn't matter. The Hurricanes and Spitfires were there. General Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, refused to believe it. "They cannot see us from the ground," he shouted during one of the heated briefings at Karen Hall, his palatial headquarters. "Someone is feeding them our plans. Find the traitor." Officers exchanged uneasy looks. There was no traitor. There was only something they couldn't explain, an invisible eye watching them from across the channel. Meanwhile, in Britain, the radar stations worked without pause. At dawn, the towers of Chain Home hummed with energy, their signals slicing through fog and cloud. Operators like Sergeant John Hopkins at Vintner tracked incoming formations with calm precision. To him, the battle had become routine. A growing cluster of green blips, a phone call, and within minutes, the roar of engines overhead. The wall of waves was holding. Frustrated, Göring ordered reconnaissance photographs of the British coast. When his analysts spread the prints across the table, they pointed out the strange steel structures rising near Dover and Bodsey, tall, skeletal towers standing in clusters of 4. "Maybe radio masts," one officer suggested. Göring waved the idea away. They can't possibly have range enough to see our aircraft. He leaned back, smug. Destroy them anyway. It will make them nervous. On August 12, 1940, at 8:10 in the morning, German bombers hit their first radar stations. Explosions tore through Ventnor, Poling, and Dover. The sky turned orange as fire rolled across the coast. But the system had been built to survive. Underground bunkers shielded the vital transmitters, and backup power came online within hours. By sunset, every damaged station except one was already back in operation. In the control room at Dover, a British technician wrote in his diary that night, "They hit us hard today. Broke glass, burned wires. We fixed it before the next wave. The radar never sleeps." Across the channel, German intelligence filed a report. The towers appear to have no military value. Recommend discontinuing attacks. Göring agreed. The Luftwaffe would focus on airfields and cities instead. The most important defense system in Britain, the one keeping the island alive, had just been deemed irrelevant by the enemy. Inside the radar stations, the crews barely noticed the victory. They were too busy working. Lightning storms, interference, endless fatigue. The screens never stopped glowing. The operators rotated in 12-hour shifts, their eyes raw from staring at the phosphor light. They measured not just distance but depth, every echo representing hundreds of lives in motion. Margaret Ellis, one of the WAF operators, later remembered, "Sometimes I'd close my eyes and still see the lines. The sound of the receiver followed me into sleep. That hum, that heartbeat. We didn't have guns, but we could feel when the sky was full of them." Still, even machines could break. The constant strain pushed the equipment to its limits. Tubes overheated, transformers burned out, and power lines snapped in the coastal wind. Engineers worked with their sleeves rolled up, soldering circuits while the sirens wailed outside. Some stations were repaired by candlelight, others by men lying flat under broken consoles while the earth shook from nearby bombs. One corporal wrote in the margin of a maintenance log, "If this thing stops, the country goes dark." The irony was cruel. The Germans believed they were bombing ordinary radio towers, while the British fought to keep them alive one wire at a time. The invisible war beneath the visible one continued hour by hour, pulse by pulse. At Göring's headquarters, the frustration boiled over. Pilots reported seeing Spitfires before reaching the coast, sometimes while still 20 miles out at sea. "Impossible," he snapped. "You're imagining it." But as the casualty list grew, his confidence thinned. He demanded to know why British fighters never seemed surprised. His intelligence chief handed him another report, captured documents from a downed RAF plane, describing early warning stations. Göring threw it aside. "Nonsense. They can't see in the dark." He was wrong. The British could, but the advantage was fragile. The system was stretched to breaking point, equipment aging, crews exhausted, the towers themselves vulnerable to weather, to luck, to fate. Then came a storm that no one could control. On a late August night, lightning lashed the coast and rain hammered the transmitters. Power surged through the circuits. Screens flickered, darkened. For the first time since the war began, the radar chain began to fail, one station at a time. Hopkins at Ventnor slammed his fist against the console. "Signal's dead," he shouted. The room went silent except for the crackle of static. Across Britain, phones rang unanswered. Controllers called out for updates that never came. For a few terrible minutes, the country's invisible shield went dark. And beyond the storm, over the channel, the German bombers were already airborne. Then, one night almost destroyed everything. Storms, fire, and a coincidence that could have changed history. The screens went dark. For the first time, Britain was blind. It happened in the middle of a storm, August 24, 1940. The rain came in sheets across the coast, driven by Atlantic wind. Lightning cracked over the channel, turning the sea white for an instant and black the next. Inside the radar stations, the air smelled of ozone and sweat. Consoles buzzed, then screamed. One by one, the scopes flickered out. At Dover, Sergeant Hopkins shouted over the noise, "We've lost the grid." Forness not responding. Sparks burst from the receiver, the glass tube glowing red before dying with a hiss. The humming silence that followed was worse than any explosion. Across the chain, phones rang without answers. Controllers shouted into deadlines. In Bentley Priory, the nerve center of Fighter Command, Messages stopped mid-sentence. The great web of light that had stretched across Britain suddenly went black. Dowding sat alone in his office, the only illumination a flickering lamp. The rain pounded against the windows. "No contact from Dover," came a voice from the hall. "No contact from Forness. We've lost the coast." He closed his eyes. For months, the radar had been their miracle, the invisible wall that gave them sight. Now it was gone. Outside, the storm rolled inland, carrying with it something far worse than rain. Across the channel, German bombers had taken off hours earlier, expecting resistance. They found none. The sky over the Thames opened to them like a door. At 11:45 p.m., the first bombs fell on London. Witnesses later said the night sky glowed orange, the heat so fierce it felt like dawn. In East End streets, people huddled in shelters, praying under the sound of collapsing glass. The sirens wailed too late. By the time they began, the city was already burning. In the darkened radar rooms, technicians worked by candlelight. Sparks flew as they ripped open panels, replacing fuses, rerouting cables through puddles on the floor. One corporal burned his hands on a live wire, wrapped them in a rag, and kept working. "If we lose the signal, we lose them all," he said through clenched teeth. At 12:20 a.m., a faint glow returned on one screen at polling. The operators held their breath. Another station came online, then another. Static turned into rhythm, the slow, familiar pulse. Hopkins slammed the switch back on. The screen flared to life, the green line sweeping once more across the glass. He could barely hear his own voice. Signal restored. Contact reacquired. Multiple echoes inbound. Within minutes, phones rang across the command network. Angels 20. Enemy inbound. The chain was alive again. Dowding rose from his chair as the lights flickered back on in the filter room. "Get me Group 12, he ordered. Controllers scrambled. Within 10 minutes, RAF squadrons were climbing into the night. Above the storm, hurricanes and Spitfires cut through the clouds toward the glow of the burning city. One pilot described it later. "You couldn't see the enemy. You just saw the fires below and hoped you were in time." In that hour, Britain fought blind and then, somehow, found its sight again. By dawn, the bombers were retreating across the channel. The radar stations still smoked, some half destroyed, but they were alive. So was the island. At first light, Dowding walked through the operations room. The women of the WAF were back at their boards, moving markers with quiet precision, as if nothing had happened. Coffee cups shook in tired hands, but no one complained. They knew how close it had been. Reports later counted 400 dead in London that night, thousands wounded. Yet the defense had held. The system had endured its trial by fire, literally. In the technical logs of the Air Ministry, the event was labeled Temporary Signal Interruption, August 24th. A dry sentence hiding the truth, that for 1 hour, the fate of Britain had balanced on a broken circuit. The engineers didn't rest. Within days, they began building mobile backup stations, radar on trucks, ready to replace any tower lost to bombs or weather. They doubled the power lines, installed generators, rewired the heart of the system. It would never go dark again. Eileen Younghusband, now a senior plotter, later said, "After that night, none of us ever looked at the green light the same way. We had seen what darkness meant. And when the radar came back, so did hope. The tide was turning. They never held a gun, but they saw the enemy before anyone else." By autumn of 1940, Britain was exhausted. Cities burned, families slept in subway tunnels, and the sky above London glowed red each night. Yet the island still stood. The Luftwaffe had thrown everything it had, waves of bombers, fleets of fighters, endless nights of fire, but it could not break the chain. In the radar stations along the coast, the operators hardly noticed the headlines. They lived by the rhythm of the signal, by the pulse of a green light sweeping over glass. Rain or snow, day or night, the towers kept humming, sending their invisible heartbeat into the sky. September 15th. The date would later be known as the Battle of Britain Day. At 10:30 that morning, the phones in Bentley Priory began ringing nonstop. Reports came in from every station. Massive formations crossing the channel, more than 1,000 aircraft. The biggest attack yet. Inside the control room, the women of the WAF worked faster than they'd ever moved before. Red markers for enemy squadrons, blue for RAF. Voices shouted coordinates. Pencils scraped. The air trembled with tension. Raid 85. Strength enormous. Altitude 20,000. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding looked at the map and made a decision that would define the war. "This is it," he said. "Scramble all we have." Across southern England, airfields came alive. Mechanics sprinted, engines roared, the grass burned under the exhaust of hurricanes and Spitfires launching into the sky. Above the Channel, clouds filled with motion, the greatest aerial battle in history. From the cliffs near Dover, civilians watched in silence. Trails of white smoke twisted into the sunlight like threads of fate. In a farmhouse near Ventnor, an old woman listened to the hum of the radar towers and whispered, "They're fighting for us." Inside the control room, Eileen Younghusband stood at her post, marking every report that came in. Fighters engaging over Canterbury. Another group forming over the coast. Her voice was calm, steady, almost detached, but her hands trembled slightly as she moved the magnets. Each small adjustment meant hundreds of men climbing, diving, dying. At 1:05 p.m., the red markers began to vanish. Controllers shouted updates. Bombers breaking off. Fighters retreating. Cheers rippled through the room, but no one relaxed yet. They had learned not to trust hope too quickly. Minutes later, the reports became clear. Dozens of German bombers down, hundreds damaged. The attack had failed. The Luftwaffe was turning back toward France. Dowding stood by the board, arms crossed, saying nothing. He only exhaled slowly, then murmured, "So, that's what victory looks like." That evening, the operators watched the last blips fade from their screens. The green line swept over empty air. For the first time in months, the sky was quiet. Outside, the radar towers stood dark against the sunset, their steel frames humming faintly in the wind. The women stepped out into the cold, their uniforms damp with sweat, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. They didn't cheer. They just looked up. The silence felt heavier than sound. Later, in a BBC broadcast, Prime Minister Winston Churchill said the words that would become legend. "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." But those who listened inside the radar stations exchanged small smiles, because they knew that the few weren't only the pilots. The ones who fought without wings had been part of that victory too. In captured German documents after the war, Luftwaffe officers wrote their bewilderment in neat, formal prose. "The English always knew. Before we came." They never discovered the full secret until years later. By then, the world had changed, and radar had become the foundation of modern warfare. The invisible guardian that began on those windy cliffs. When Eileen Younghusband retired decades later, she was asked what she remembered most. She paused, then said softly, "The sound of the signal. That hum that meant we could see. We didn't win with guns. We won because we could see." In her final diary entry, she wrote, "We were the eyes of Britain. We saw the darkness coming and gave the country time to wake." The towers of Chain Home would stand for decades more, their metal rusting, their cables cut, but their legacy echoing in every radar screen that came after. The invention once dismissed as a dream had become the difference between survival and oblivion. When historians look back on the Battle of Britain, they speak of courage, of pilots and fire and storms. But beneath all that, hidden in the hum of electricity and the patience of those unseen women and men, was something quieter, the sound of a nation learning to see. In a war of fire and steel, Britain's strongest weapon was something no one could see. And that changed everything.